So far we've been writing all of our tests against the video game database, but soon we're going to want to start writing some tests against the football data API as well. Now, in order to do that, we need to make some changes to our base class in our framework, so our test config class. At the moment, the way that we've set it up is that we assume that we're always just going to be calling the video game database in this framework, but we're actually going to call both of the endpoints separate, so we want to separate out these request specifications. So let's have a look at how we can do that now. So at the moment everything is just coded into the app before class, but to have one separate for each, we need to break them up and declare some variables outside of the app before class. So let's look at how to do that now. So I think probably the easiest ways to do this is for us to just take out all of this code and just start again. So the only thing that we'll leave in is the proxy setting, because we want to keep on sending proxy traffic through our Fiddler proxy. So that's fine. So we've got a new test config class now. So we're going to start over by declaring statically the request specification outside of the before class method. And we're going to make it specifically for the video game database. So we'll just call it video game request spec. So we'll just do this one first. So now inside of the actual setup class, setup method rather, we're going to call that video game request spec, and we're going to make a new request spec builder. So this is similar to what we did before, but we're actually setting this up now inside the before class, but we've declared a request specification outside so that it can be initialized before when we call it. So we'll see what we mean in a moment. So now so if you remember before we had the base URI and the ports, everything set up here. This meant that it would apply to all of the rest assured tests here. And now we're going to set this up in the actual request spec. So let's see how we do that. So we will just call the set base URI method. And we set our base URI for the video game database is localhost. We're also going to set the ports. And finally we'll set the base path as well. So this was everything that we had set up before, but now this is being set up just specifically for this request. We also had a couple of headers in there as well, so I'll just add those back in quickly. So we had the headers that were in there to allow us to set content type and accept to JSON. Say application/JSON. Oops, and add another header for accept. And again, application/JSON. And then finally we want to call the build that will actually build this request spec for us. So before, if we wanted to set this request spec for every request, we would set this setting here. So we would call rest assured dot request specification, and we would set it to the video game request spec, and that would set it for every single one of them. But because we're going to start adding in calls to the football API as well, we're going to want to separate these out and just call them individually. So I'm just going to comment that out just for the moment. And if we look at our other video game DB tests, if we just look at an example for this delete game, because we don't have any request specs at the moment, we can just call spec and then link to that actual request spec. So now when this test gets called, it will link to everything in this request spec. That's where it gets set each time. So when we add in the one for the football data as well, we can then have them separate, and then we'll be able to call them both in our test. So while we're here, let's add in our response spec as well that we took out. So again, this is in a very similar way. We do public static response specification. We'll call it video game response spec. Okay, if we just go down here again, now we take the video game response spec And again, we do a new response spec builder. And again, we add in the common parts that we want to see in the response. So in this case, we're just going to have expect a status code of 200. And then finally call the build. So again, if we want to set that for all of the responses in our rest assured framework, we can add in the option here, dot response specification, and then we'll set it to video game response spec. Or again, if we just wanted to specify it individually on a per basis, we could take that out, and then instead of the spec being called here, we call the spec specifically after the then for the response spec. If I say dot spec, and again we called in video game response spec. Tidy that up slightly. So now we're just calling that spec specifically at the time of the test. Now again, it depends on your framework. If you know that you're always going to just be running your rest assured tests are always going to be pretty much the same, you can just set them here like we have done so far. So I'll add that back in now so that it doesn't break all of the other tests, or you could set it on an individual test basis. So when we add in support for the Football Data API, this has made it easy for us to set that up now. We can just copy these, make them, change them for the Football Data API, and then when we run our tests, we could just specify which specification we want at the time of writing our tests. So we're going to add in the support now for the Football Data API. Just thinking about it, I'm going to leave the response spec the same for both of them, for the video game and the Football Data API, just to make it a little bit simpler. So to do that, I'm just going to refactor this. I'm just going to rename this. We do refactor, rename, and I'll just rename it to response spec so that it's not specific to either of them. So we'll rename to that to response spec. We'll make some room down here because we're going to leave that unknown. So the only thing we're going to make a new request spec for is for the Football Data API. So we call public static, again another request specification, and we'll just call it football underscore request spec. Very similarly down here, we just add in the call then to the football request spec. We do a new request spec builder. So it's very similar to the one that we've done before, the one that we've done above, but this one is just for the football API. So we call the base URI. So the base URI for the football API is here. If I just copy and paste that in to save some time. Doesn't have a specific port, so we don't need to worry about that, and we'll just set the base path, and the base path is /v1/. Now we're also going to add in a couple of headers as well. So if you remember, with the football API you can apply for a token. If you don't apply for a token, you can only make 50 calls, I believe it is, a day at the time of recording this video. With a token you can make 50 a second, so as I mentioned before, it's well worth getting a token. I'll just add mine in here. Let me just copy and paste that. And there's one more header I'm going to add so that we get the minimum response back, so that we don't get all of the extra metadata that might just confuse us in our tests. So we just add this extra response control header and we call it minified. So now at the moment, rest assured is set by default to talk to the video, to be the video game request spec, and that's been fine up to now for all of our tests. But now when we write our tests, we can actually specifically call the football API, and we can call the football request spec. So we'll see how to do that when we start writing football tests, but I just wanted to get our framework set up for us now. We're going to leave, as I say, the response spec the same because I want the response spec to be common between the video game and the football data. It's just the request spec that needs to change, and so now we have a request spec for the video game and a request spec for the football. I hope that's clear. I'll see you in the next lecture.